The post offices and mile markers of Southall Town. The earliest colonies in the New World were for many years isolated from each other. People living in Jamestown, Virginia, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, as well as later colonies, each made deals with the ship captains to carry letters back and forth to Europe. A system to carry letters between the colonies was eventually started around 1639 by independent businessmen, but most of these businesses did not last very long. In our area, a route between Boston and New York started in 1672. The British Crown granted the right to run the first central post organization to Thomas Neal in 1691. Neal was allowed to create post offices and set prices. For a short while, he was also allowed to charge a postal tax on all official documents. He opened for business in February 1692. Neal never came to the New World. He appointed Andrew Hamilton, the governor of New Jersey, as his deputy to oversee and run the operation. In 1710, the king took back control of the postal system in the colonies. The British Parliament decided to extend the British postal system, known as the Crown Post, to the colonies, and establish the main office for the New World in New York. Most of the mail at that time was government or business correspondence. Because the price to send a letter was very expensive, most people usually found a traveler who would pass along their letters to other travelers until the letter eventually made its way to its destination. Benjamin Franklin was appointed postmaster of Philadelphia in 1737, a highly prized job for a newspaper printer, since the position allowed the printer to gather and distribute the news. Postmasters could decide what could be mailed and how much it would cost. Franklin was in charge of a group of post offices around Philadelphia when the Postmaster General, Elliot Benger, had to step down due to health reasons. Franklin was named Joint Postmaster General with William Hunter of Virginia in 1753. The British government decided that Franklin and Hunter would each have a salary of £300, but only if the post office made a profit. Franklin's first job was to reorganize the postal system. He devised and introduced a basic accounting system for use in all post offices. He spent 10 weeks traveling throughout the northern colonies, mapping out the most efficient routes for the mail to travel on, and setting up procedures on how to handle the mail. One of his most important tasks was to visit every post office to make sure that each postmaster in the system was an honest man who was capable of handling the job. Up to 1753, the post office in North America had never made a profit, and Franklin and Hunter had to loan money to their new business to make it work. Determined to get a salary and recover the money he had invested in the post office, Franklin worked hard on changing the way the mail was handled. In 1755, Augustus Griffin of Orient noted that Dr. Franklin came to Greenport to catch the ferry to New London. He wrote that his uncle Samuel Griffin remembered that Franklin had passed through in a carriage of his own construction. It was so contrived with a clockwork or machinery of peculiar make that a bell would be struck at the termination of every 20 rods. That same year, Franklin spent time on planning postal routes in New England and opened a new post office in Halifax in Canada, the newest area of the British colonies. In 1763, Franklin again toured all of the post roads and the post offices from Virginia throughout the Northeast, checking the work of each postmaster along the route, although he probably did not have his coachmen wearing red coats like these gentlemen. Mile markers were a common sight in the colonies along the sides of the major roads. Men elected to the position of Commissioner of Highway were given the job to make sure that the roadways were wide enough so a wagon could get through, each road usually measuring about 4 rods wide, which is 66.4 feet, each rod measuring about 16.5 feet. Prior to the American Revolution, our local records show that roadways were marked with wooden stakes and with symbols carved into nearby trees. In 1829, New York State passed a statute requiring that all commissioners of highways erect mile markers, which is when the mile markers that exist along the town of Southold were probably installed. The size and shape of the mile markers vary by region. For example, in Southold Town, our mile markers are white granite rectangles about 5 to 7 feet in overall length. Remember, 2 to 3 feet of the length is buried to hold the stone upright, so you only see the 2 to 3 feet that remain above ground. In other areas of the country, the stones were made of red sandstone, or had an arch top, or other differences. In Southold, the stones mark the distance to the Suffolk Courthouse in Riverhead, which is where the county government offices for our area were during the colonial period. The post office took advantage of the mile markers set up along the sides of the roads. The markers were possibly used to estimate the cost of mailing a letter, but they were also used to help guide the postal riders along their section of route to deliver the mail to the next rider and the next post office. Letters traveling less than 60 miles could cost between 4 pence and 1 shilling 4 pence, depending on its weight. In 1772, Hugh Findlay, who was the surveyor of the post road, traveled the postal route from his home in Canada to New York City, stopping to inspect each post office to make sure that it was being run honestly and there were no problems. According to the journal that he kept during the trip, mail from Canada and from all over the Northeast was taken to Boston, and from there it was carried along the Connecticut shoreline by horsemen along the Boston Post Road down to New York City, with local mail being dropped off at its destination along the way. Mail destined for Europe was then put on a boat, and mail staying in the colonies was sorted and taken to its destination. Mail could be paid by either the sender or it could be sent collect, with the person receiving the letter or package responsible for paying the postage. In 1774, Benjamin Franklin was dismissed from the job as Postmaster General. The king and the British government thought he was not only too sympathetic to the colonial unrest, but he also opened and published the contents of the Massachusetts Royal Governor's correspondence in his newspaper. 1775, the Second Continental Congress authorized the creation of an alternative postal system to replace the Crown Post. This is a year before the Declaration of Independence is signed. Benjamin Franklin was appointed by Congress to head the new postal system at a salary of £1,000 a year. In 1776, Franklin decided to accept the position of American emissary to France, and he turned the job of Postmaster General over to his son-in-law, Richard Bach, who served as a Postmaster General until 1782. While the post office created by the Second Continental Congress continued to function, it wasn't until 1792 that the official U.S. Post Office was created and headed by Timothy Pickering of Philadelphia. Pickering, in 1794, decided to open post offices on Long Island. He established 10 post offices located in Jamaica, Queens County Court, Jericho, Huntington, Smithtown, Coram, Suffolk County Court, now known as Riverhead, Southampton, Bridgehampton, and Sag Harbor. In our area, the first local post offices opened in Southold in 1802 with John Franks as the postmaster, Mattituck 1802 with John Hubbard as the postmaster, Cutchogue in 1814, Benjamin Case postmaster, Oyster Ponds 1821, Joseph Terry postmaster, but Oyster Ponds later changes its name to Orient. Greenport 1832, John Clark postmaster, Peconic 1848, Thomas A. Tuttle postmaster, East Marion the 1850s with Benjamin C. Tuttle postmaster, Laurel 1898, and New Suffolk opened its post office somewhere between 1898 and 1925. It wasn't until 1813 that the post office began to use boats to carry mail to towns where no roads existed. In 1838, taking advantage of modern technology, all railroads in the United States were designated as postal routes, changing the way the mail was carried throughout the country. The Long Island Railroad extended and opened its tracks from New York to Greenport in 1844 and started delivering mail to the East End and our local post offices. 1847, the first U.S. postage stamps are issued. Benjamin Franklin appears on the 5-cent stamp and George Washington on the 10-cent version. The post office grew with the nation, and when people began to move west, so did the post office, hiring the U.S. Mail Steamship Company and the Pacific Mail Steamship Company to start carrying the mail from New York to California. It wasn't until after 1863 that the post office began free delivery of the mail by letter carrier. By the end of the Civil War, free mail delivery was available in 65 cities across the United States. But it wasn't until 1902 that rural areas like ours could have home delivery. Mailboxes at home were not required until 1912. So next time you drive past the post office or spot one of the South Hole Town mile markers, think of all of the history that is a part of our town.